"We need your house for the baby," my son said, as if he were asking me to pass the salt, not take the one thing I had left in this world, and I remember the exact way his voice sounded, calm, certain, already decided, like my answer didn't matter at all. I didn't respond right away, I just looked down at my plate, at the pot roast I had spent all afternoon cooking, the same recipe his father used to love. The same meal that once meant comfort and family and warmth, and now it sat there between us like something cold and unfamiliar. Ashley reached for her glass of water without looking at me, her fingers perfectly manicured, her expression unreadable but composed, like she had rehearsed this moment in her head a dozen times before walking into my dining room. "It just makes sense," Daniel added, finally meeting my eyes, and there it was, that subtle shift, that quiet distance I had been trying not to see for months, maybe longer. I folded my hands in my lap, steady, controlled, the way I had learned to be after 50 years of marriage, after loss, after learning that not every emotion deserves to be shown to the people who hurt you. The house felt different that night, even though nothing had physically changed, the same walls, the same oak table, the same soft yellow light hanging above us, but something in the air had shifted, like I was no longer sitting in my own home, just occupying space that someone else had already claimed. "And why is that my problem?" I said, my voice quieter than I expected, but firm enough to stop the sound of silverware against plates, firm enough that Ashley finally looked at me directly. For a second, just a second, there was something in Daniel's face, a flicker of surprise, maybe even discomfort, as if he hadn't considered that I might not simply nod, might not agree, might not step aside the way I always had before. No one spoke after that. Not immediately, and the silence stretched long enough for me to hear the faint ticking of the clock in the hallway, the one Robert had insisted on keeping even after it started losing time, because he said some things were worth holding on to even if they weren't perfect anymore. I thought of him then, of the way he used to sit in that same chair Daniel was in now, his hand resting lightly on the table, his presence filling the room in a way that made everything feel anchored, safe, unquestionable. Without him, everything felt negotiable, including me. Ashley cleared her throat softly, a small, controlled sound, and reached for Daniel's hand under the table. I noticed because I always notice the things people think I don't, and when she spoke again, her voice was smooth, almost gentle. "We're just trying to think about what's best for everyone." And I almost smiled at that, at the way everyone had suddenly become a word that didn't include me anymore. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't remind them that I had paid every mortgage bill in this house alongside Robert, that I had raised Daniel within these walls, that every corner of this place held pieces of a life they were now discussing like it was an asset on paper. Instead, I picked up my fork, cut a small piece of meat, and took a bite, even though I couldn't taste anything, because sometimes the strongest thing you can do is continue as if nothing has been taken from you yet, even when you know it has already begun. The rest of that dinner passed in a quiet that felt heavier than any argument we could have had, and when they finally left, I stood at the front door a little longer than necessary, watching Daniel's car disappear down the street as if I might recognize something in the way he drove, some trace of the boy who used to wave at me through the rear window, but there was nothing familiar left in that silhouette. Just a man who had learned to speak to his mother like she was an obstacle to be managed. I locked the door carefully, the same way I had done every night for over 30 years, turning the deadbolt until it clicked, a small, solid sound that used to mean safety, and now felt more like a question I did not yet know how to answer. The house was too quiet after they left, not the peaceful quiet I had grown used to since Robert passed, but something sharper, like the walls themselves were listening, holding on to every word that had been said at that table. I walked back into the dining room and began clearing the plates, stacking them one by one, my movements slow and deliberate, because rushing would have meant acknowledging that something had changed, and I was not ready to give them that yet. Daniel's plate was barely touched, Ashley's completely clean, mine somewhere in between, and I noticed details like that because details are where the truth hides, and the things people do not think you are paying attention to. I carried everything into the kitchen, set the dishes in the sink, and turned on the faucet, letting the water run longer than necessary, just to fill the silence with something that sounded steady, predictable, under my control. As I washed each plate, I found myself remembering other dinners, birthdays, holidays, nights when Daniel would sit in that same chair and talk about his day, when he still asked my opinion before making decisions. When this house was not something he evaluated in terms of square footage and potential, but simply home. I dried my hands on a towel and leaned lightly against the counter, my eyes drifting to the back door where Robert used to come in after working in the yard, always tracking in a little dirt no matter how many times I reminded him, always smiling like it was a small rebellion he intended to keep. He had built so much of this place with his own hands, the shelves in the living room, the deck out back. Even the small imperfections in the hallway floor that only we knew about, and the thought of those things being repurposed, redesigned, or worse, erased entirely, settled somewhere deep in my chest without making a sound. I turned off the kitchen light and walked slowly through the house, room by room, not because I needed to check anything, but because I needed to feel it, to remind myself that this was still mine, that I was still here, that nothing had been taken yet. Even if the conversation at dinner had tried to make it feel inevitable. When I reached the bedroom, I paused at the doorway, my hand resting lightly against the frame, and for a moment I almost expected to see Robert sitting on the edge of the bed, reading glasses low on his nose, asking me what had taken me so long, but the room was exactly as I had left it that morning, still, quiet, waiting. I stepped inside and sat down on my side of the bed, the mattress dipping slightly beneath me, familiar and unchanged, and I realized then that whatever Daniel and Ashley thought they were doing, whatever plans they had already started building in their heads, they had made one very simple mistake. They had assumed that because I was alone, I was also weak, and as I sat there in the quiet, I understood something just as clearly as I had understood his words at the dinner table. I did not need to raise my voice to be heard, and I did not need to argue to refuse, because some things are not negotiated, they are simply held, and this house, every inch of it, was one of those things. The next morning arrived quietly, the kind of soft, gray light filtering through the curtains that usually made everything feel calm, predictable, but as I stood in the kitchen pouring myself a cup of coffee, I noticed how different the silence felt, not empty, but watchful, like something had already shifted beneath the surface and was waiting for me to catch up to it. I carried my mug into the living room and sat in Robert's old chair. The one he had claimed as his years ago, the leather worn just enough to hold the shape of his presence, and I let my eyes move slowly across the room, taking in the small things I had stopped actively seeing, the framed photographs on the mantel, the bookshelf he built himself, the faint scratch near the baseboard from when Daniel was 10 and thought he could bring his bicycle inside without me noticing. I had spent so many years protecting this space, maintaining it, holding it together for everyone else, that I had never stopped to consider what it might look like through someone else's eyes, someone who did not see memories, but opportunity. By mid-morning, I found myself standing at the hallway window, looking out toward the driveway, not because I was expecting anyone, but because something in me had begun to anticipate movement, and when Daniel's car pulled in just after 11, I was not surprised, not really. Only aware that whatever had started the night before was not finished. He stepped out of the car alone, his shoulders slightly tense, his movements quicker than usual, like he had come with a purpose he was trying to carry through before it slipped away from him, and when he knocked on the door, he did not wait long before knocking again, a small detail, but one that told me more than anything he might say once he was inside. I opened the door and stepped back without speaking, allowing him to walk past me into the house as if it were already familiar territory. As if the conversation from the night before had granted him some unspoken permission. "I have been thinking," he said, not looking at me right away, his eyes moving instead around the room, lingering on the walls, the layout, the space, measuring in a way that felt precise, intentional, and entirely new. I did not respond, I simply watched him, the way I used to watch him when he was younger and trying to explain something he knew was not entirely right, waiting for him to reveal what he had already decided. "It is just not practical for you to be here alone," he continued, finally turning toward me, his tone softer now, more controlled, as if he had adjusted it on the drive over, refined it into something he believed would sound reasonable. I took a slow sip of my coffee, letting the warmth settle before answering, not because I needed time, but because I wanted him to feel the space between his words and mine, to understand that this was no longer a conversation he could rush through. Practical for who? I asked, setting the mug down carefully on the table. Beside me, the sound of ceramic against wood quiet but deliberate. He hesitated then, just for a moment, and in that pause I saw it clearly, not uncertainty, but calculation, the same careful weighing I had noticed in Ashley the night before, as if they had both come to the same conclusion and were now working through the steps to make it real. For everyone, he said again, repeating the same word, but it sounded thinner this time, less convincing, like something that had already begun to lose its shape. I nodded once, slowly, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement, because sometimes the most important thing is not to interrupt, not to argue, but to let people continue until they show you exactly who they have become, and as I looked at my son standing there in the middle of the home I had built with his father, I understood that whatever came next would not be about convincing him, it would be about deciding how much of myself I was willing to let him take before I stopped him. I let his words settle into the room without responding right away, because I had learned over the years that silence has a way of revealing more than questions ever could, and Daniel, like most people who think they are in control of a conversation, did not know how to sit with it for long. He shifted his weight slightly, his eyes moving again around the living room, pausing on the fireplace, the windows, the open space that Ashley had admired more than once, and I could almost see the version of this house forming in his mind, rearranged, repurposed, stripped of the things that made it ours and filled instead with whatever they believed their future should look like. We could make it work really well, he continued, stepping a little farther into the room, his voice taking on that careful tone again, the one that tried to sound reasonable while quietly assuming agreement. There is enough space for everyone, and it would be good for you too. You would not have to be alone all the time. I watched him as he spoke, not interrupting, not correcting him, just observing, the way I had started to do more often lately, noticing not just what he said but how he said it, the small pauses, the way he avoided certain words, the way, you, always seemed to come second to, we. And where exactly would I be in this plan? I asked finally, my voice calm, almost curious, as if I were asking about something distant, something that did not involve me directly. He hesitated again, longer. This time, and for a brief moment, something unguarded crossed his face, not guilt exactly, but the awareness that he had not fully thought that part through, or perhaps that he had, and did not want to say it out loud. You would still have your room, he said, and the way he phrased it, the way he reduced everything I had built, everything I had lived in, to a single room, told me more than anything else he could have said. I nodded slowly, letting that settle, because sometimes the clearest truths come wrapped in the simplest sentences. My mind drifted then, not away from the moment, but deeper into it, back to the years when Robert and I had first bought this place, when the paint was still fresh and the floors still smelled of varnish, when we had stood in the empty living room and talked about where everything would go, where Daniel's room would be, where we would celebrate holidays, where we would grow old together. Robert had always been certain about one thing, he used to say it in that quiet, steady way of his, that this house was not just a structure, it was a promise, something we built not only for ourselves but for the life we believed in, and he had made me promise, more than once, that no matter what happened, I would never let anyone make me feel like I did not belong here. I came back to the present and looked at my son standing in front of me, a man who had grown up within those very walls, who had once run down these hallways without a thought, and I realized how easily something that was meant to be shared could be rewritten into something to be taken. It sounds like you have already decided what this house is for, I said quietly, not accusing, not emotional, just stating what had become obvious, and he opened his mouth to respond, but I lifted my hand slightly, not to stop him, but to slow him down, to make sure that whatever came next would not be rushed past the truth that had already surfaced. You are talking about space, I continued, my voice steady, but I am talking about ownership. And for the first time since he had walked into the house that morning, he did not have an immediate answer, and in that silence, I understood that this was no longer about convincing me of anything, it was about whether he could convince himself that what he was asking was something he had the right to take. Daniel did not answer right away, and I could see the shift happening in real time, the moment where confidence gives way to something else, something less certain, less rehearsed, and he glanced toward the hallway as if expecting Ashley to appear and finish the conversation for him. But of course she was not there, and for the first time, he was standing in this house without someone guiding his words. "That is not what I meant," he said finally, though his tone lacked the conviction it had carried earlier, and I noticed how quickly he tried to soften what had already been made clear, how easily he moved from certainty to correction, as if the right phrasing might change the meaning of what he was asking. I did not argue with him. I did not repeat what he had said, because there was no need to press against something that had already revealed itself. Instead, I walked past him slowly, into the kitchen, not as an escape but as a choice, because movement changes the balance of a conversation, and I wanted him to follow, to step into my space rather than remain in the one he had mentally claimed. I could hear him behind me a moment later. His footsteps quieter now, less assured, and I reached for the kettle out of habit. Filling it with water, setting it on the stove, giving my hands something simple and familiar to do while the rest of the moment settled into place. "You know it would help everyone," he continued, standing near the doorway, not fully entering the kitchen, as if there was still an invisible line he was unsure about crossing. "With the baby coming, we just need more room, and this place." He paused, and I finished the thought silently for him. This place would make things easier, this place would solve their problems, this place would become theirs if I allowed it. The kettle began to hum softly, the sound building in a steady, predictable way, and I let it continue, because there was something grounding in that, something that reminded me that not everything in this moment was uncertain. "Do you remember the summer you were 12? I asked, not turning to face him yet, my voice calm, almost reflective, and he hesitated before answering, caught off guard by the shift. "When you tried to build that treehouse in the backyard by yourself," I continued, "and it collapsed before you even finished the floor." He let out a small breath, something between a laugh and a sigh. "Yeah, I remember," he said, though his voice was quieter now, pulled into the memory whether he intended to be or not. I turned then, meeting his eyes. "You came inside covered in dirt, frustrated, ready to give up, and your father told you something I never forgot," I said, watching carefully as the past settled between us. "He said, if you want something to stand, you build it yourself. You do not take what someone else already built just because it is easier." Daniel looked at me then, really looked at me, and for a moment the room felt smaller, more contained, like the walls themselves were holding on to every word. "This house," I said quietly, gesturing slightly around us, "was built over decades, not just with money, but with time, with patience, with choices you were too young to see at the time." And I let that sit there, not as an accusation, but as a truth he could not easily dismiss. The kettle reached a soft whistle, and I turned off the stove, the sound fading quickly into silence, and when I spoke again, my voice was steady, unchanged. "You are asking for something that already stands," I said, "but you are not asking what it cost to build it, or what it would cost me to give it up." And this time, when the silence returned, it did not feel uncertain, it felt defined, like a line had been drawn, not loudly, not dramatically, but clearly enough that even he could see it. Daniel did not move right away after I finished speaking, and for a moment he just stood there in the doorway, his hands shifting slightly at his sides as if he was trying to decide whether to continue or retreat, and I could see the conflict in him now, not the kind that leads to change, but the kind that searches for a different angle, a better argument, something that would still bring him back to the outcome he had already chosen. "You are making this harder than it needs to be," he said. Eventually, his voice lower, less certain, but still holding on to that quiet insistence that had followed him into the house, and I recognized it instantly, not as strength, but as pressure, the kind that builds slowly, carefully, until it feels easier to give and then to keep standing where you are. I reached for a cup and poured the hot water over a tea bag, watching the color spread through the water in slow, controlled swirls, and I let the moment stretch just long enough for him to feel it again, that space where his words did not immediately land. Hard for who? I asked again, not because I needed the answer, but because repetition has a way of stripping away excuses, of narrowing things down to what they really are. He exhaled, running a hand through his hair in a gesture I had seen countless times when he was younger, when he was frustrated with something he could not quite solve, and for a second, I saw that boy again, the one who used to come to me for answers instead of standing across from me trying to justify taking something that was not his. For all of us, he said, but this time the words felt thinner, like something he no longer fully believed in himself. I lifted the cup and took a small sip, letting the warmth settle before I spoke again, because calm is not something you show, it is something you maintain, especially when the person across from you is waiting for you to break it. You keep saying all of us, I said quietly, setting the cup back down with care. But every version of this plan seems to begin with me giving something up and end with you gaining something from it. And I watched as that landed, not dramatically, not sharply, but with enough clarity that he could not easily step around it. He looked away then, his eyes moving toward the window, toward the backyard where he had once spent entire afternoons running through the grass without thinking about ownership or space or what belonged to whom. And I wondered if he could see it the same way now, or if even that had changed. Ashley thinks it would be better this way, he added after a moment, and there it was, the part he had been holding back, the influence that had shaped the conversation from the beginning, and I did not react to her name, not outwardly, because this was not about her, not. Really, it was about the choices he was making and the way he had decided to present them as something inevitable. I nodded once, slowly, acknowledging the statement without accepting it, and stepped closer. Just enough that he had to meet my eyes again. Ashley does not decide what happens in this house, I said, my voice even, not raised, not sharp, just certain. And neither do you, not unless I choose to give you that right. And I let that settle, not as a challenge, but as a fact that had always been true, even if he had started to forget it. The room felt quiet again, but this time it was not uncertain or heavy, it was clear, defined, like the edges of something that could no longer be blurred. And as I stood there, looking at my son in the home I had built, I realized that whatever happened next would not come from convincing him to understand me. It would come from deciding that I did not need him to. Daniel did not argue after that, not immediately, and that in itself told me more than anything he could have said because he had always been quick with words when he believed he was right, always ready to explain, to justify, to convince. But now he stood there in the kitchen, quiet in a way that did not belong to him. As if something in the conversation had shifted beyond his control. He gave a small nod, not agreement. Not acceptance, just acknowledgement, and then he stepped back, creating a little more distance between us, the kind of distance people take when they realize they are no longer leading the direction of a moment. I should go, he said after a while, his voice neutral, carefully placed, and I did not stop him. I did not soften what had been said or offer anything to make the leaving easier, because there are moments when clarity matters more than comfort. I walked him to the door, the same way I always had, out of habit more than anything else, and when he stepped outside, he hesitated just long enough to glance back at the house, at me, at something he might have been trying to measure or reconsider. But whatever it was, he did not say it out loud, and then he turned and walked toward his car. I closed the door gently behind him and stood there for a moment, my hand resting against the wood, feeling the solidness of it, the certainty, the quiet strength of something that had not moved, not changed, not been handed over just because someone asked for it. The house settled around me again, the same rooms, the same light, the same quiet, but now there was a difference in how it felt, not heavier, not emptier, but clearer, like something that had been uncertain the night before had now taken shape. I moved slowly through the hallway, past the living room, into the study where Robert used to keep his papers. The room still holding that faint scent of old books and polished wood, and I sat down at his desk, running my fingers lightly across the surface, tracing the small marks left by years of use. There were things I had not looked at in a long time, documents, folders, details that had always been there but never needed to be questioned, because I had trusted that what we built together would remain as it was, protected by the simple understanding of family. but understanding, I realize now, is not something that holds on its own, it depends on the people who choose to honor it, and when they stop, the responsibility shifts. I opened one of the drawers and looked inside, not searching for anything specific at first, just reminding myself of what existed, what had been put in place long before this moment, and as I moved through the papers, I felt something settle into certainty, not fear, not doubt, but clarity, the kind that does not come from reacting, but from seeing things exactly as they are. I closed the drawer carefully and sat back, my hands resting in my lap, and for the first time since that dinner, I allowed myself to think ahead, not about what Daniel wanted, not about what Ashley expected, but about what I would do next, because this was no longer just a conversation, it was a line, and I had already decided which side of it I was standing on. I did not need to raise my voice, I did not need to explain myself again. I did not need to make them understand, because some things are not meant to be negotiated into acceptance, they are meant to be held with quiet certainty. And as I sat there in that room, surrounded by everything that had been built over a lifetime, I understood that whatever they believed they were planning, whatever future they had imagined for this house, they had forgotten one simple truth: it was never theirs to begin with. 2 days passed without a call, without a message, without even the kind of silence that feels accidental, and I understood that this was not distance, it was strategy, the kind that waits, that assumes time will soften resistance, that if you give someone enough space they will begin to question themselves instead of you. I did not fill that silence, I let it remain exactly as it was, uninterrupted. Because I had no intention of negotiating with absence. On the third evening, just as the light outside began to fade into that soft gray that settles over everything before night, Daniel returned, but this time he was not alone, and I saw Ashley step out of the car beside him, one hand resting lightly on her stomach in a gesture that felt practiced, intentional, and when they walked toward the front door together, their pace matched, their expressions composed. I knew this was no longer a conversation, it was a presentation. I opened the door before they knocked, not out of anticipation, but because I had been watching from the window, observing the way they approached, the quiet coordination between them, and I stepped aside without a word, allowing them to enter the house as if it were still the same place they had left, even though something fundamental had already changed. Ashley smiled as she walked in, that same polite, controlled smile she wore at every family gathering, but her eyes moved quickly, taking in the room, the layout, the space, not with warmth, but with assessment, and Daniel followed just behind her, his posture more assured than it had been before, as if whatever uncertainty he had felt in the kitchen 2 days ago had been replaced with something steadier, something reinforced. "We thought it would be better to talk together," Ashley said, her voice smooth, measured, and I nodded once, acknowledging the statement without agreeing to anything it implied, because I had learned that people often disguise decisions as discussions when they believe the outcome is already theirs. I led them into the living room and took my usual seat, not out of habit this time, but because placement matters, and I wanted them to sit across from me, not beside me, not within my space, but facing it. Ashley sat first, her movements careful, deliberate, while Daniel remained standing for a moment before taking the chair beside her, and for a second, no one spoke, the quiet stretching just enough to reveal who would break it first. "We have been thinking about what is best long term," Ashley began, her hands resting lightly in her lap, her tone carrying that same gentle authority that had shaped Daniel's words before, and I noticed how easily she positioned herself at the center of the conversation, not as a participant, but as the one guiding it. I did not interrupt, I did not react, I simply listened, because listening is where people reveal their intentions most clearly. "This house is perfect for raising a family," she continued, her eyes meeting mine now, steady, confident. "And it does not make sense for it to be underused when it could serve a bigger purpose." And there it was again, the language of practicality, of logic, of turning something personal into something functional, as if meaning could be replaced by efficiency. I leaned back slightly in my chair, not withdrawing, but settling, letting their words unfold fully before I responded, and I noticed how Daniel glanced at me briefly, searching, measuring, waiting for some sign that I might respond the way he expected, the way he had prepared for. But I gave him nothing, no resistance, no agreement, just stillness. Because sometimes the most unsettling thing you can offer is not opposition, but the absence of it, Ashley continued, filling the silence with explanations, plans, possibilities, each one built on the assumption that the foundation had already been secured, and as I listened, I understood something with complete clarity. They were not here to ask, they were here to finalize, to move from discussion to execution. And the only question left was whether they realized that the decision they believed had already been made was never theirs to make in the first place. I let her finish every word she had prepared, every carefully chosen sentence about space and practicality and what made sense for the future, and when she finally stopped, the room fell into a silence that did not feel empty, but complete, like something had reached its natural end. Daniel looked at me then, expectant, waiting for the response he believed would follow, something emotional, something reactive, something he could work with, but I remained still, my hands resting lightly against the arms of the chair, my posture unchanged, because there was nothing in what they had said that required urgency, only clarity. I leaned forward slightly, not to challenge, but to close the distance just enough that my words would not be mistaken or softened by space, and I met their eyes one at a time, first Ashley, then Daniel, allowing each of them to feel that I was speaking directly, not generally. You have both put a great deal of thought into this, I said, my voice calm, even, not dismissive, not impressed, simply acknowledging what was already obvious, and I saw a flicker of relief in Daniel's expression, the brief assumption that acknowledgement meant agreement, that calm meant surrender. I let that assumption exist for just a moment, long enough for it to settle, long enough for it to become something he leaned on, and then I reached beside the chair, where I had placed a folder earlier that afternoon, resting there quietly, unnoticed, like something that did not need to announce itself to hold its weight. I placed it gently on the table in front of me, not sliding it toward them, not presenting it as an argument, just setting it down as something that existed, something real. Ashley's eyes moved to it immediately, sharp, attentive, while Daniel's followed a second later, slower, more uncertain. And I opened the folder with deliberate care, turning it so that it faced me first, not them, because control is not something you hand over, it is something you maintain in the smallest of gestures. This house, I continued, my voice steady, was placed entirely in my name 20 years ago. And I paused, not for effect, but because the truth deserves its own space. Your father made sure of that, I added, watching as Daniel's expression shifted, confusion first, then something closer to realization. I lifted one page slightly, not enough for them to read, but enough for them to understand that what I was saying was not open to interpretation, not based on memory or emotion, but documented, intentional, final. There are also provisions, I said, turning the page back down, my tone unchanged, that prevent any transfer, sale, or shared ownership without my direct and sole consent. And this time I let my eyes rest on Ashley, because I knew she would understand the language, the structure, the implication of something that had already been decided long before she entered this house. The silence that followed was different from the ones before, not uncertain, not heavy, but clear, like a door closing without noise. Daniel shifted in his seat, his shoulders tightening slightly, and for a moment he looked as though he might speak, might try to reframe, to adjust, but no words came, because there are moments when explanation no longer fits into the space that remains. I closed the folder and rested my hand on top of it, not protectively, not defensively, just firmly, as one might rest a hand on something that belongs exactly where it is. You are talking about what makes sense for your future, I said quietly, my voice steady enough that it did not need to rise. But this house was never part of that decision. And I let that stand without elaboration, without apology. No one argued after that, no one raised their voice, no one needed to, because some conclusions do not arrive with conflict, they arrive with certainty. And as I sat there in the home I had built, looking at the two people who had come expecting something else entirely, I understood that what they had mistaken for opportunity had always been something else entirely, something they were never given the right to take.